Okay, so continuing on our mask demo, we just did a quick tour around on the basic arrangement of the models, views, controllers, and a quick look at how controllers and views work with the naming conventions and so on, right? We've changed the nullable property for the overall project to work more consistently with how we've done it in the past. But what we need to do next is we want to get ready to start building our models. But before we even do that, okay, what we want to do is we want to prepare to use our new database, right? I mentioned already that we're going to be using SQLite. So I could do this in a number of ways, but I could just come down here to the Package Manager console. Now, if you don't have that open, just go down to Tools, NuGet Package Manager. You have a couple of choices. You can just go into this Manage NuGet Packages for Solution, right? We'll do that later on, but for now, I'm just going to go to the NuGet Package Manager, which is a PowerShell interface allowing us to actually execute these commands in here. So the first command I'm going to run is install package. Now, there is not IntelliSense in the same way we're used to using it in C# inside the package manager console here. Usually by this point, though, my system must be busy doing something else. It usually comes up with what is called code completion, right? It suggests that, is this the command you're writing, and it's ready to complete it by pressing the tab key. Install package, see? Oh, for heaven's sakes. I'm just going to copy and paste it. I don't know why it's not coming up with it for me. All right, I wanted to demonstrate that. Oh, well. I'm sure it'll work later when it feels like it. So install package. And what is the package? Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So similar to what we saw here in our, pardon me, I'll double click that again. SQL Server, right? This package reference was already there. We're going to install the package for SQLite. So I'll just press enter there, and look at that. It already added it here. So we have the SQLite package installed now, right? And that did not take very long. Now, so we're gonna, you might say, well, why don't we take out SQL Server? No, I'm not gonna do that for a couple reasons, but the main reason is that later on, we'll be showing how you can switch back and forth relatively easily between the two different databases, right? So I'm gonna leave the SQL Server there. The tools is common, works with both, right? Okay, so that's something else I wanted to get done already as we prepare to move forward, okay? All right, so just save that. We'll close that. And then we already modified everything in that project file that we need to. Okay, so next, as promised, we're going to add our first model of our own. So I'm going to right click the models folder. That's where we always add a model, right? We're going to add a class, okay? Now for the class name, I'm just going to call it mask. Right? We usually name our classes in the singular form. So if we have a collection of them, we name that with a plural, right? So a collection of mask objects we would call masks, for example, right? So public class mask, right? So I'm going to add a few properties here. You've probably used these snippets before. Look at that, just trying to help me out. That's not what I want. Prop, okay? Now, this is a code snippet, right, for a property. And there's a lot of choices. If I did prop full, tab, right, then that gives me the full layout for a property where it defines in code my getter, my setter, so I can come in here. I have my private variable, right, that I store the value in from the public property, etc., right? I could go this route, but I don't really need to. Because this is what we often call a POCO, a plain old CLR object. Our classes are going to be very, very simple the way we're doing this approach. So if I just go prop and don't say anything else and go tab, then we get this short form version, okay, of a property, right? Basically, in the end, it gets compiled to look exactly the same way as if I'd use prop full, right? So I can tab through though. I tabbed over the data choice because I do want an int, but I'm just going to call it ID. Why am I calling it ID? Well, okay. Basically, we have three different ways that we can define and fine tune a model. First of all, there are naming conventions, right? Then we're going to see we can then further narrow things down with data annotations and add a lot more, not only specific requirements for the data that goes into it, but also feedback for the user interface and so on, all through data annotations. If we can't do something by naming conventions and data annotations, our third choice is to use what's called the Fluent API. When we get to that, uh, we're going to add that. That'll be code that we put in our DB context. And there we can define everything. If you really wanted to, you could do it all in the Fluent API. But it's much easier to follow that order. If you can do it with a simple naming convention, that's the quickest and easiest way. Then we resort to data annotations. And if we can't do it with either of those, then we use the Fluent API to actually write code to specify the features of our models, right? So getting back to a naming convention here. So my public int ID, right? Every entity should have a primary key. In fact, must have a primary key unless we change something to allow it otherwise, right? But best practice is every entity needs a primary key, a unique identifier, right? Now, in terms of a naming convention, because the class is named mask, I have a choice. I could go with mask ID, right? Mask, whatever the class name is, with the letters ID added to the end. And by the naming convention, the system would understand, oh, well, this is supposed to be the primary key. That's the one choice. We have a second choice. I can just use the letters ID, right? Either is technically acceptable. I'll encourage you to follow my practice. My practice is just use ID. Sometimes, mainly when we get to inheriting, one model inherits from another model, it makes it less complicated, right? If we just stick with ID, right? And that's a nice, simple naming convention to follow. Okay, so mask ID, the ID property of the mask, will already be understood to be the primary key. Now, if you want to use something else, of course, simplest thing would be to use a data annotation like key, right? Notice that it immediately added, of course, in the old days, earlier versions of C Sharp, I would have had to, that would be underlined and have to right click and ask it to add the using for system component model data annotations, right? So that's another way that I could specify that this was the primary key instead. But it's not needed, it's not required. I'm going to leave the using there because it'll come in handy later on. Okay, so that's my first property I'm going to add, my primary key. And that's typically, I'm just using an integer for now. That's certainly sufficient for what I need to do. Okay, then, yeah, it's prompting for required, which we'll get to later on. So prop, tab. Now in this case, I want a string. Whoop. And I'm just going to call it mask type, right? So we'll type in here as a string things like N95 versus surgical mask and so on and so forth. And then prop, maybe I'm going to do a double to hold the price. Okay, so that is my basic, okay, mask, right? I can type in the type of mask and the price, right? And that identifies the mask for me with the unique identifier. Okay, now we'll be actually adding to this later on, but the reason it's so bare bones is I want to show you migrations and how we can make changes to our model with new migrations. All right, so that gives me my model. Now, coming back to my data folder then, here is where we orchestrate all the data manipulation. So the thing I have to add now is my own DB context. That's the abstraction, similar to our repository idea. The DB context takes care of all the discussion with the database that actually takes place, right? So we'll add our class. I'm going to call it mask context. Okay. Notice it's in the data namespace because I created it in the data folder, but it is going to inherit from DB context, right? And notice it automatically added the using for Entity Framework Core. Okay, very good. All right, so I need a constructor. Look at that. It's writing all my work for me. Huh. Almost the way I would want it. Okay. Tab to accept. Okay, that's fine. Only I don't really need to specify this. I can just say mask because I want the using for the model's namespace. There we go. Okay. All right. So what is a DB set? Well, a DB set is like any other collection, like a list and so on, except it has particular capabilities related to the DB context, right? So the ability to then add and update and delete and so on and so forth, right? So that's what our DB set is. Okay, so now our DB context is ready. So we have our mask, we have our way to talk to the database, right? But we have to tell the DB context a few things. Notice there are options that are going to be injected in whenever we create our mask context, right? Well, how do they get in place? Well, a lot of that happens here in program.cs. If I come down here, maybe I'll make this go away to give us maximum screen space. Right? Notice we start off, we create a builder for the web application. This system uses dependency injection, right? So basically, we can inject into our objects the things that they depend upon. And that's a great way to design an application because it makes it very decoupled, right? Because we're injecting things. And so instead of having it always depend on a particular object, by injecting the objects in that are required, then they don't have to exist until we need them, and we can easily substitute. So for things like unit testing, we can easily substitute a mock or fake object instead of the real one, just for testing purposes, right? Okay, so I'm going to put some spacing in here so we can see things a little more clearly. First thing here is our connection string, right? So that's okay. We have our connection string, right? And then we have some services that we're adding. Oh, look at this one, right? Add DB context, application DB context, okay, using SQL Server, right? Well, we want to add our own new DB context as well, but we want both of these to actually utilize SQLite. Let me show you this before I go on. Instead of using SQL Server, now that I've added the SQLite support, I can say use SQLite, right? So now even the application DB context will use SQLite, right? And then I'm going to want to basically do the same thing for my mask context. So for my mask context, I'm going to use SQLite and the connection string, right? Okay, now I need to modify the connection string as well, right? So you'll notice that both of these DB context objects are now using the same connection string, right? Well, that connection string, of course, is defined up here. Basically, our builder goes to the configuration information to get the connection string for default connection, right? So right now, they're both set up to use the same connection string. Which one? Default connection. Well, where is that configuration file? Where is that defined? Yet we can't do without all configuration settings, so that's right here in appsettings.json. So right now there's this configuration string section. The default connection is defined using SQL Server, right? Because that was the initial thought, is when we added the identity system that it would use SQL Server. Well, we can comment that out, right? And then we can define our own default connection using SQLite instead, okay? Um, There we go. Now you see that the uh, connection string is much more simple for SQLite. It's just a file name of the database file itself, right? And this is basically the same type we were using last term as well, local DB, MS, et cetera, et cetera. That's just a big long GUID there added to the end of the mass demo. Trusted connection, true, et cetera, right? But we don't need all that for SQLite. We just need this. Now, I'll maybe, before we go on, mention what if you did want separate connection strings? Maybe you wanted the identity system to use one database and all of your production tables to use a different one. Well, you could arrange that in a number of ways. Basically, you'd have to have two separate connection strings defined here. Just change the name. So one might be your production connection or a security connection or whatever name you want. And then back here in program CS, right, you could actually just create two different variables here, one for each connection string, and use the appropriate one down below. But we'll leave it this way because they're both using the same connection string at this point in time. Okay, so basically we have everything in place now. We've added our DB context. We have modified the connection string to use the correct database, and we really don't need to do anything else. We're ready to actually add our first migration, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's just do a build first. Just make sure everything builds fine. All right, build succeeded. So once more, I'm going to display that package manager console. And we're going to do a add migration, right? Now I have to say dash context because we have two, right? We have two separate DB contexts, okay? So my context is mask context. That's the name of my DB context. Now, I don't want it to just be in data, right? Or worse, even just in the root of the project. I want to keep it organized. So I'm going to specify that the dash O, I could just use the letter O for short, but I'm going to put the whole command output dir, right? This is where I want it to create the migrations, right? I only have to do that for the first one. When I add more migrations to the same context, it will actually always use this folder that I define now. So it's going to be under my data folder, and I'll maybe go with something like FM for face mask migrations. Okay. Now, the other thing I need, I'm going to put a capital M on there because we always have a capital M on migrations. The other thing I am going to be prompted for is a name, right? We saw before, even under here, that, oh, sorry, under migrations, okay, create identity schema, that's the name of this migration, right? So you always have to give a name. So if I press enter now, it will actually prompt me for a name, or I could just go space and give the name here as part of the command. Oh, maybe I'll show you it prompting me because we always forget sometimes, right? Supply values for the following parameter name. I'll just call it initial. It's our initial migration. Okay, and bada bing, bada boom. Yes, it finished, and it even opened up the migration for us, right? There we go. So what do we see? Well, let me point out here in the data folder, you see FM migrations. We have our initial migration. Now this time, we actually see the whole timestamp of when it was created. A timestamp is important because it helps as well to keep them in order, right? So if you make further changes, add a new migration, et cetera, away you go. Okay, so create table masks, right? There are the three columns, okay? Now notice that it's written just type as text and real and so on because these are the terms used by SQLite, and it's SQLite auto increment, right? Basically, it's the same as an identity, integer identity. Okay, and then we define the primary key as ID, and away we go. The down, okay, the opposite of the up. The down is just to drop the table, and that's it. All right, so let's go ahead and actually implement this. So coming back to, once more, our package manager console, I can now just update database. I have to say which context. And that's it. All right, so let me point out, look at that. So it actually wrote the SQL commands, okay, right? There's our create table mask, and that's the actual SQL in the terminology used by SQLite to actually create the table itself and all the properties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, notice it's also handling this migration history table as well. Obviously, to keep track of the changes we've made to the database, if we look in the database itself, okay, it's sitting right here. Now, I can't just double click on it, right? I did mention at the beginning to install this tool. Okay, it's this extension to Visual Studio, SQLite, SQL Server Compact Toolbox. If I open that tool, I can click the little plug connection here, add a database, and then it looks and sees, oh, here's your mask database, right? Now I can examine the tables. So there's that migrations history table, but here is our mask table, right? So I see the ID, mask type, price, and so on. Now, if you don't install that option and you don't want to come and look at it, you really probably never really need to, okay? It's just kind of helpful sometimes. Notice I can also do things like right click, edit top 200 rows. This is similar to the functionality that you see inside SQL Server Management Studio. So now I could actually come in here, mask type, N95, price is $15, right? Surgical, $5, etc. Right? Now the IDs aren't showing up because that's just a limitation of this tool. It seems. I don't know why. It seems to work sometimes and not other times, depending on the version. But it's actually saving the data. So if I close this and show it again, you see that the IDs were actually created, right? So I've actually added some data to the table itself, right? Okay. All right. So that's good enough for now. So, um, but you know what? Oh, we realized, darn, we forgot something. Okay. So let me close this, clean up the screen a little bit. Okay. Let's come back to mask, right? Oh, we wanted to add a description property, right? So I'm going to quickly do that. I'll add a public string called description. Wow, you might think, oh crap, now, oh, sorry, right? What am I going to have to do? I'm going to have to drop the database, recreate it all over again? No, okay? Now, I'll be honest with you, even last term, right, with .NET 6 and the support for SQLite and any framework core, you actually, I just taught the students basically do that because there were only a few exceptions. There were only very minor changes you could make to the actual model class that didn't require basically starting from scratch again. But they've made tremendous changes now. There's only now a few things you can't do, right? Uh, and then we can just add a new migration. So we'll finish that process first, but then I'll show you what the alternate is, right? So we've modified the model here, right? So what do we have to do? Let's come back down to the Package Manager console. Now, one thing, if I go to the bottom here, one thing that I'm sure will be working is if you use the up arrow, it will bring up all of your previous commands, right? So here's the command to create or add a new migration. Okay, I don't need this after the first one, so I'll take that out. And I might as well put the name in, added description, into DESC, good enough. So that's the name for this migration. I'll just press enter. Okay, so now you see it's created a new migration. The up is to add a column, okay, called description to the table mask, type text, nullable, true, right? The down is to drop the column, okay? And we see, okay, now we have a series of migrations, right? Good. Coming down to the Package Manager console again. Let's go back up to the update database command. I'll just press enter to execute that. And there we go, right? Notice it also updates that migration history as well as it executes the command, right, to actually alter the table, okay, add to the description, and away we go. So if I come back up here, I have to click refresh, right? But looking in masks, now I have the description property. But look at this. If I go and look at the data, I didn't lose data, right? Now, sometimes it can just do that. Now, in this case, it was very simple. We just had to add the new property, right? And that's all there was. If it's a more complex change, what it will actually do is it'll create a temporary table, migrate the data over to it, make the change to the table, and migrate the data back in, right? But if it's a super complex change, sometimes it just can't do it. And you go to update database and you get an error saying basically it's not possible. Okay. So what would you do in that case? Well, basically this. And this is how our students had to work over and over again last term, right? Basically, what we're going to do is I'm going to say, you know what? We're going to start from scratch. And I should mention this isn't just as a last resort because you can't apply yet another migration. Every once in a while, if you're really happy with all the changes and improvements you've made to the model, right? There's nothing technically wrong with saying, okay, well, we're going to just start from this design for the model and go forward, okay? We don't ever see a need to roll back to an earlier state in terms of the design of the model. So it's 3 steps. I delete the migration, the entire migration folder. There it is, gone, right? I delete the entire database and these other files along with it. Oh, okay. Give me a hard time because this is open. No. Okay. Well, that's a bit of an issue. Okay. Well, that was a bit of a pain, but eventually I was able to delete them. Worst case scenario, close the project and open it again, right? So now the migrations are gone, the database is gone, right? So once more, I will basically recreate my initial migration, right? So add migration, okay, my initial. Now notice the difference, right? We've also created the description because it's looked at the current state of our model and it sees 4 properties: ID, mass type, price, and description. Okay. So we haven't lost anything. The only thing we actually technically did lose was the bit of data I typed in the database. Is that the end of the world? Well, it's maybe a consideration, but actually not much of one because the truth is, until right you're ready to actually start using this in production, the data in there is meaningless, right? Typically, what we're going to learn to do very soon is have the system automatically generate some seed data. Okay, that way we can actually run the database and have some data to work with right away every time, even if we do have to start over from scratch, right? So by seeding data in, it gets around that issue altogether, and it doesn't really matter if we've deleted the database. Okay, but you see we're creating everything all at once, okay? So now I'll just update database, and there we go. So now we have our database back, and the database has all of the required fields in it, and away we go, right? Yeah, it has the description as well. So if I really wanted to, this time I'm going to go ahead. I'll put a mass type again, N95. Price was, what did I have last time? $15. And description, best one I have. There we go. All right, so that's been saved to the database. There we are. Okay, so everything is in place. We're all good, right? Okay, now let's consider this. We said naming conventions are the first thing. Then we can add data migrations. We add these data annotations, right? We added the using for it. Now, at the moment, I'm not actually making use of that. But there's all kinds of things that are available in data annotations that can work both ways. That can help us actually refine, right? It can help us refine the actual structure of how it's stored in the database. And at the same time, it can help us with things like feedback to the user in the user interface for things like validation requirements and so on. Okay. And mask type, that's not a very friendly looking name, is it? Right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and do it. We're going to actually generate our first view here. So we actually create the controller, and that process by default will also create the views, right? So if I right click controllers and say add a controller, it's going to be an MVC controller, right, with views using Entity Framework. So I'll click add. Now the model class is our mask model. The DB context is the mask context, right? We're going to generate views, everything else here, and it's going to be the masks controller, right? So I'll click add. And scaffolding, updating. So part of the scaffolding process is it's going to actually generate the views as well. Okay, so here is our mask controller, right? Very interesting to have a look at this. So what do we see? Well, the constructor, we pass in the context. That'll be our mask context object, right? So that's how we get that in here to our private read-only context. Again, that is part of the dependency injection system that's built into this template, okay? And then we have our index, details, create. Look at all this stuff. Edit, edit, delete, delete. Why are they duplicated there? And then mask exists, right? Okay, let's start at the top, right? So coming back here, okay, the first one is our index. Notice it's a action result, okay, and it returns a view, right, of our mask2 list. Now, this is the data, right? Remember, it knows the name of the view to use, but this is the data it's passing to the view. This is an example of a link query. Well, we've done this kind of work before. The context, okay, we just go dot mask, and that gets us the mask collection. And then we're saying to list. Okay, that gets us a list of all the mask objects, and that's the data we pass to the view. Well, let's have a look at that view. So here in the views folder, see it's automatically added following the naming convention for the masks controller. We have the masks folder here of views, and there's 5 of them: index, edit, details, delete, and create, right? So the index view, again, using some Razor code up here, title index. We could say mask index if you want. Change that, right? Create new mask, etc. Well, you can fine tune it to your heart's degree. But here we have a table, okay? Data gets laid out in a table by default. In the header row, we have display name for the mask type, the price, and description. And down below, we'll have a for each loop, each item in the model. What is the model? Well, that's right up here. The model, right, for the view is our collection, IEnumerable collection of mask objects. Where did it come from? It came from this link query here, just this list of masks coming from our DB context, right? So it'll just loop through them all in the for each loop. Each item is one mask at a time in our model, right? And then we'll show the display for using this HTML helper, okay? The mask type, the price, and description. And we have some links to the other, okay, views, and away we go. All right, so let's actually run it and see what it looks like. Okay, so now notice I don't have a link in the navigation system yet. That's something I probably should have done. So we have home, we have privacy, right? But I can just go slash masks, and that's the name of my controller, right? And that gets me the mask index, right? So there's the one piece of data that I have. Now I can edit. The very best one that I have, I'll save that. Okay, and there we go. And we can see we're actually able to edit. I can see the details. This all got scaffolded back to the list. I could select delete. Are you sure you want to delete this? I'll say back to the list to cancel. No, I don't want to delete it. It's my only piece of data. But I could right away create a new one, right? But look at this mask type. That's not very friendly looking. Okay, price and description, they stand on their own, but mask type is not a very good name to use, is it? Right. So let's stop running for a second. Now, without doing anything that actually prompts me to make a new migration at this stage, let's come back to mask. Right. What I could do is I could add display name, I should say. Right. Display name type of mask. Okay. If I run again, I could have used my hot reload, come to think of it. Really should add that. Now you see it says type of mask here. When I edit, it says type of mask everywhere. So it's using that display name very intelligently. I just had to change it in one spot, and no matter where I go, right, it's using that display name. So that's one of the nice things about data annotations. Okay. What other things might we want to do in data annotations? Well, what about a validation requirement? Okay. I can say required and give an error message. The type of mask is required, right? What if I want to limit the number of characters? Ooh, look at that. String length, okay? I'm going to limit it to 64 characters. The mask type limited to 64 characters, right? So that's actually the error message that would display to the user as well, okay? Maybe I want to do something similar for the description, right? It's required, can't leave it blank, can't, it's pretty long description, but I'm going to put that in there anyway, okay? And what about the price? Well, maybe I want to say that it's required, right? And at the same time, I can specify data type is currency. And that will affect how it's displayed as well. So if I do a hot reload here, oh, I should save it first, then do my hot reload. All right, so where are we? Okay. Notice the currency is shown there with the dollar sign, okay? And if I go to edit, let's take that out, click save. Now I get my custom error message here. The name of the type of mask is required, right? And away we go. Um, if I put in something ridiculously long, oh, actually notice it stopped at 64, right? It won't even let me type more characters than that. So that's great. That's even better, right? Uh, yeah, kind of a yucky name. So I'll put that back the way it was. Okay. All right, so you see the idea. So data annotations are very powerful as well. Now, sometimes certain data annotations might force us to do a new migration, but the system will always come up and let you know if that's the case. All right. Actually, I'm going to stop and start again because this is getting a pretty long video.